Order, please. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. You know, Mr. Speaker, just a few months ago, this House passed the Premier's own Regulatory Reporting and Accountability Act. That Act included a charter of governing principles for regulation which states, and I quote, "The government will regulate to achieve its policy objective only where an analysis of costs and benefits demonstrates that the regulatory approach is superior by a clear margin to alternative self-regulatory or non-regulatory approaches," something we all agree with. Mr. Speaker, it's hard to imagine that that actually happened in the case of the Minister of Fisheries imposing a unilateral lobster course or more red tape on our lobster buyers. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why is he allowing the Minister of Fisheries to ignore his own charter so shortly after it was enacted?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As you would know, the Minister of Fisheries has engaged the industry for months on this issue. We know that there are businesses in this province that are currently actually doing what the Minister is proposing goes across the sector. As he knows, this has been a tremendous boom in the exporting of our lobster and seafood under the great work done by the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture. I continue to work with them. I want to make sure that we continue to have that high quality, particularly as we're getting into markets further afield. Mr. Speaker, really pleased with the growth we've had in Asia. Next week I'll be making an announcement in relationship to Asia, and this kind of continued work with our private sector industries will continue to ensure that we grow that exporting market.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I hope the Premier isn't giving credit to the Minister of Fisheries for the growth in the catch of our lobster fisheries. We all celebrate it, but we know the reason, Mr. Speaker. In fact, what the Minister of Fisheries said was that the reason that, well, it's not because of the Minister of Fisheries.
The Canadian dollar.
Order, please. The Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Nothing to do with the Minister.
Order, please. Order, please. Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Fisheries certainly did not consult with lobster buyers, because if he did, he would not have said this about why he's imposing new red tape on them, because the reason he gave was, and I quote from him, "Some people just don't really understand lobster." Well, that's an insult to lobster buyers who have been doing their job in some cases for generations, Mr. Speaker. But my point is, it flies in the face of the Premier's own charter on regulations. So I'll ask the Premier, why is he ignoring his own red tape legislation by allowing the Minister of Fisheries to create more red tape?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As he would know, this is about ensuring that the quality of our seafood continues to remain high. Mr. Speaker, I do want to recognize the Minister of Fisheries, who's worked extremely hard along with the industry to ensure that Mr. Speaker, we've doubled our exports into Asia. Mr. Speaker, that's exactly why the price of lobster is high, Mr. Speaker, because we've opened up more markets, working directly with industry to ensure that we're getting maximum value for that product, Mr. Speaker, and we're enjoying that, and we're continuing. And, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work with our private sector, Mr. Speaker, to grow good jobs in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, our private sector, including lobster buyers, would have a lot more confidence in this minister and the government if they didn't say one thing and do another, if they didn't pass a charter saying there'd be less red tape and then months later impose more red tape on lobster buyers, Mr. Speaker. The charter says that they have to look at non-regulatory and other options before imposing new red tape, Mr. Speaker, but that did not happen. So I'd like to ask the Premier, will he confirm that his charter was followed and that analysis was done of other options besides more red tape? And if it was, will he table it in the House?
The Honourable Premier.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the good work being done by the Office of Regulatory Reform. Very pleased with the work that's taken place. We've been able to streamline the process, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, going through the process where we can add to ensure that we remain the high-quality product that we have, high-quality live product that we're shipping further and further afield, Mr. Speaker, identifying where we can provide support to that sector so that we can continue to remain to get top dollar for the good quality product that we have, Mr. Speaker. The minister, as every minister on this side, will continue to work with the private sector to ensure that the opportunities are in this province and that we get real value for the products that we sell them across the world.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to replacing the VG, this government's main objective has been to incur as little cost as possible during the term, placing its austerity agenda ahead of the need for investment in public infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Premier said, and I quote, "Right after becoming Premier, the file of the VG came on my desk," and I'll table that. My question for the Premier is, if the VG file has been on his desk since 2013, why, after 2.5 years, are we just hearing about a so-called replacement plan?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is, one of the first decisions we made was to invest in the Dartmouth General, Mr. Speaker, the 3rd and 4th floor, which is clearly related to the Victoria General Hospital. 50 beds are being moved out of there, Mr. Speaker, over. We're removing 4 operating theatres over there, which will add, Mr. Speaker, to 8 on the Dartmouth side. We then went out and did something that the former government did not, which was engage clinicians and healthcare providers to make sure, Mr. Speaker, as we design the growth as we move out, that it fits the needs of the next 50 years. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to collaborate with our healthcare providers to ensure that not only, Mr. Speaker, will we build this facility on time and on budget, but it will meet the requirements of the healthcare workers and the citizens of this province.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has had no answer for repeated questions about the cost of replacing the VG or how this unknown cost will be paid for. The lack of details around cost and revenue suggests yesterday's announcement was nothing more than a plan to make a plan. With much work to be done in the short term, there's also concern that the budget released Tuesday does not reflect these short-term costs. My question for the Premier is, when it comes to replacing the VG, where is the fiscal plan?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member, and she should not be insulting the hard-working Nova Scotians who have been working to ensure that these healthcare facilities get in place across this province. We've been engaging healthcare workers, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that when we continue to do the work on the Dartmouth General, which has been costed and put out there, Mr. Speaker, we budgeted this year to do the design work for the new builds at the HI site, not only the 5th floor, but the new construction, as well as our community-based outpatients clinic that will be outside of HRM. That design cost is a part of this year's budget. We have allocated in our TCA that we'll be able to do the work in West Hants to ensure that the 2nd OR is open. 800 surgeries that will be moved out taking place there, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to tell you, outside of this House, every Nova Scotian who's spoken to me about this says, finally, a government is acting prudent. Mr. Speaker, a member from the Conservative caucus said yesterday in the media, maybe the Premier should just guess at the cost instead of doing the prudent thing that Nova Scotians expected to do.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
I don't want you to guess at it. I just want you to tell us. I don't want you to guess.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has repeatedly said that being in government requires you to make choices. Well, Mr. Speaker, past governments have made the choice to use the P3 model for public infrastructure, including a few Liberal governments in Nova Scotia. As the Premier's own Deputy Minister of Health...
Order, please. The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party has the floor. There's plenty of questions left here, so everybody will get their chance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Premier's own Deputy Minister of Health has pointed out, those choices ended up costing taxpayers millions of extra dollars. My question to the Premier is, has he not learned from past Liberal governments in Nova Scotia who chose to use the P3 model?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I said, we're going through preparing the design work, making sure that the facility meets the needs of Nova Scotians for the next 50 years and is there and meets the needs of the healthcare workers who are providing that service to our citizens. When that comes out, Mr. Speaker, we'll put full costing out to Nova Scotians and we'll look at how, Mr. Speaker, we finance that, and it would be irresponsible of our government or any government not to look at the P3 model and see if that is a better way to finance it. Doesn't mean we've agreed to that position, but we'll certainly be exploring it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Premier's Charter on governing principles for regulation is supposed to mean something. Certainly to our lobster buyers, it meant the government wanted to cut red tape. And yet, months after they passed the Charter, they imposed new red tape on lobster buyers. They do good work, Mr. Speaker. The quality of Nova Scotia lobsters is high because they know what they are doing. They don't need more red tape to make that so, Mr. Speaker. The Premier passed a charter, his own charter, which assured them that wouldn't happen. So I'm going to ask the Premier, does he now see that what the Fisheries Department is doing actually breaches the Premier's own charter on red tape?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate the Department of Fisheries for the tremendous work they've been doing, working with the sector across our province, continuing to grow export opportunities, continue to grow revenue for the province and for the private sector. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank them for the tremendous work they've been doing on the agriculture side, looking forward to growing that sector. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are optimistic about the future, Mr. Speaker, particularly those who are out there in the private sector driving opportunity because the government now is working with them in partnership.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, those Nova Scotians that are lobster buyers want the government to get off their back. That's the point, Mr. Speaker, which they told them in law they were going to do. But instead, rather than having confidence in them, they thank them by telling them they have to fix the job they do by imposing more red tape on our lobster buyers just when they have a chance to move ahead, Mr. Speaker. It's inconceivable that a government would say one thing in law and then actually do the opposite for an industry that is so important to the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. So here is a chance to actually cut some red tape. Will the Premier honour his own charter and cut this needless red tape for our lobster buyers now?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to work with the Office of Regulatory Reform to cut red tape across this province, unifying situations across the Atlantic region, Mr. Speaker. Private sector has been involved in the decision-making we've been making, Mr. Speaker. They're optimistic about the future. We're seeing the most confidence in small business in all of Canada is right here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. They're endorsing the direction of this government, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to work with them to provide opportunity here at home.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Women across Nova Scotia are without proper gynecological health services. In a briefing note prepared for the Minister, which I know we've used in the last session, it states that obstetrics coverage in the northern zone is tenuous. That's a great concern to expecting mothers and their families. The Minister's briefing note also shows that surgical wait times in gynecology has risen by 20% in the last 2 years. Valley Regional has seen the most significant increase, over 62%, after gynecologists have had their access to the operating room reduced. So I'd like to ask the Minister, what steps has the Minister taken to improve operating room access for gynecologists in order to meet the high demand for this important service?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for an important question here in the Assembly today. What has taken place just in a very short period of 6 months is that now we're able to move residents from one part of the province to another for services, and I think if he gets an update today, he'll find that, in fact, some of that wait list has gone down. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about a segment of the population that moving to far-off communities could be a challenge when you're an expecting mother, Mr. Speaker, and that needs to be seriously looked at. These services need to be available close to home. Mr. Speaker, not only are expectant mothers worried about obstetrics, but many are equally as worried about access to midwifery services. In Nova Scotia, midwifery services are available only in 3 sites, and the demand for these services far exceed the capacity. So I'd like to ask the Minister, it looks like this year's budget doesn't reflect the urgency to address the needs to increase midwifery services in Nova Scotia, which could help relieve some of the anxiety and concerns that Nova Scotians have for these services.
The Honourable Minister of Health. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And just a little note of clarification first. In terms of gynecological services and surgeries, these are planned, and we're not talking about expectant mothers. In terms of midwifery, the member opposite is absolutely correct. It's an outstanding service where it is provided. We know that in the past number of months, the Health Authority has been doing a clinical services review, and when that is complete, they will start a provincial program of advancing midwifery further throughout the province. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Energy. Nalcor has a new CEO, and he has openly said that he will be re-evaluating the Muskrat Falls project. My question for the Minister is what assurances has the Minister received that the project will be completed?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I had the opportunity to speak to Minister Cody, Minister of Natural Resources, responsible for the file in Newfoundland and Labrador, following the resignation of Mr. Martin as chair. As you know, Newfoundland and Labrador, the new government has undergone a review of the project, and with that there's been some issues that have been raised, but Mr. Cody did assure me that their government remains committed to this project. In fact, they are looking at receiving updates as far as what the new construction timelines will be in light of some of the delays that have been experienced, and we expect to receive that information once the government of Newfoundland and Labrador has received it.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians have been asked to pay for the $1.5 billion maritime link through their power rates, and they're obviously concerned about what might happen to power rates given the risk of the cancellation of the project or skyrocketing costs. So can the Minister tell Nova Scotians that their power rates will not go up due to the turmoil in Newfoundland?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, the agreement that was reached between Emera and Nalcor is between two companies. It is not between the province of Nova Scotia, and taxpayers in Nova Scotia are in no way on the hook for the subsea cable that's being built. That is being responsibility of Emera, and that is something that Emera, not Nova Scotia Power, but Emera is responsible for. So ratepayers are not involved in that project in any way at all. Mr. Speaker, the electricity plan which we provided does have provisions for Muskrat Falls being part of our energy mix. I certainly indicated that to Minister Cody of our concerns of any delays in that project, which is why I was pleased to hear her commitment to seeing the project take place and to provide us with updates as to what the construction timeframes will look like as soon as they receive them.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Reform in the Department of Community Services is very much needed. We all know that. And people struggle to find the necessary resources to live in this difficult time. One of the complaints that come from many constituents is the difficulty they have in communicating with their social workers. Is communication one of the reforms that's being considered?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for his thoughtful question. One of the number one complaints I hear in my own constituency is that I cannot get in contact with my frontline worker. One of the things that we changed almost immediately when coming into government was to look at a realignment of home visits, because we know home visits are needed, particularly in the rural areas, but they're not always needed in other places. Oftentimes home visits were a means to check in on clients to make sure that they were doing what they needed to be doing. We've since changed that policy because it was really important that people be available at their desk, that they be available for communication. We try to set up guidelines so that we get back to people within the day, if not the next day, just to ensure that that service delivery is increased and that people can speak to the people who are providing them services.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
And I do appreciate that. I'm hoping that there still will be some leeway for the social worker to go to the home visit, because in some cases it's necessary. How far along are we on the reform roadmap?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. The transformation actually started within the first 6 months of my ministerial role. We are about halfway through phase 2. It is a 3-phased approach. We are anticipating the outcome and the finality of the complete transformation to be in 2018. I'm very encouraged at the time frame. We have met all targets in terms of time, investment, and where we want to go. The first phase was, of course, the internal restructuring of our department, which was a complete overhaul of the collapsing of the regions, centralizing a lot of the services to improve service delivery, and actually for the first time ever having somebody responsible for service delivery standards in the department.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. When this government set out to amalgamate the district health authorities, there was plenty of talk, Mr. Speaker, about the administrative cost savings, $10 million, $15 million. They promised Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. However, the budget released this week calls into question just how much money will be saved on administration. For this year, the administration budget for the Health Authority is $13.6 million higher than what was spent last year. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, can he explain why the administration budget for the Health Authority is $13.6 million higher than what was spent last year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I want to be able to say to the member opposite, first and foremost, is that the Health Authority, their budget is all ready to be passed by their board, and when that does come out within the next probably the next few weeks, he will see, the province of Nova Scotia will see the great leap forward in holding costs and saving huge amounts of money.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, 2.5 years ago, this government had been adamant about the need to stick to the fiscal plan, giving Nova Scotians the impression there was no new money for much-needed investment in public infrastructure, such as hospitals. However, we learned in the budget release Tuesday that the budget for hospital infrastructure was underspent by over $27 million, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister explain why the hospital infrastructure budget was underspent by such a significant amount of money?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We all know that planning and long-range development of hospital infrastructure will sometimes get behind. This is absolutely nothing new in our province or right across the country. What I do know is that we'll soon be opening an outstanding addition in Guysborough. The work in Dartmouth is well underway. The medical centre in Shelburne will get started this year, and perhaps I shouldn't give any further list. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. And I think the Minister is expecting this question as the family let them know they're expecting to hear from the Minister today. And they're in the gallery with us. The Enhanced Family Services Program is intended to provide support to parents where children with disabilities live with their families. The problem is, while a family might meet all the criteria, the Minister has not authorized enough funds to actually deliver the program to all those who qualify, and there's currently a 2-year waiting list, according to her staff. The Jones family is with us in the gallery. Their adopted son, Leo, is 22. He has fetal alcohol syndrome, and yet they are struggling through the transformational plans underway at DCS. Last night, they were told, quote, regarding the enhanced support, I have followed up, and Leo continues to be waitlisted, but there are no additional funds at this time. And I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, the enhanced family...
Does the member have a question?
I do, sir. Why didn't the Minister address the funding shortfall for this critical care program?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I thank the member for the question. We actually have addressed the shortfall in this upcoming budget. We've invested a further $3.3 million to build capacity in the community so that we can actually enhance and build up the capacity needed for persons to move from residential care into the community, and also to make day programs and other programs that are available in the community more robust. That's on top of a further $9.9 million investment for the disability support program.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I understand in 45 seconds the Minister can't get all the information on the case frame, but her own staff said, in fact, this has not been topped up. As well, for 3 years they've been trying to get a group home space. They were told in the letter that I just tabled that this individual is ranked a priority #1, but for 3 years they've been told that Community Services has those spaces on hold due to, quote, transformational change. Mr. Speaker, when their son Leo attends programs like Stonehearth Bakery, his parents have to attend with them because DCS is unable to provide somebody for them, and they say it's due to funding. Mr. Speaker, that means his parents can't work when they have to, and it's affecting the finances of the family. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister think it's right that this family is being hurt because in 3 years the Department hasn't been able to address the wait list for Priority 1 housing? And what does she plan to do about it?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. Nobody puts their name on a ballot to be accused of hurting families in Nova Scotia, and it's a disingenuous question in that regard. There are pressures within the disability support program. We all know that. We all deal that with programs and families in each one of our constituencies. The wait lists are being managed within the Department of Community Services. We also have the highest rate of self-identified disability in the country, and we're trying to keep up with the growing demand and the complexity of needs. I'm excited about the new investment. Our commitment to the roadmap is steadfast, and families know that. I understand that people can be impatient with that. I totally get that. I totally understand that. But we are doing transformation to the best of our ability at this point in time.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Business. There are several areas of rural Nova Scotia that still don't have cell service. And I don't mean adequate cell service, I mean no cell service. And many of these areas have aging populations, and it's a real safety concern. Just last week in the Garden of Eden area in Pictou County, an oil truck went off the road close to the lake, complete dead zone, no cell service, even emergency responders' devices didn't work there. And so my question for the Minister is, what is the Minister doing to help those rural areas that desperately need cell phone service?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the industry itself continued to assess and analyze the needs of self-service across the province, and those industry entities are investing their own capital in expanding the availability of service. We've seen recently a number of towers that have been erected. They continue with that strategy, and we support them in that private sector-led initiative.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Well, the support for those industries isn't working for many rural Nova Scotians. There is technology now that if you have cell service, you can also have internet service through that. And I have areas where local residents have offered to give the land to the service providers to let them put up a tower. I've had that in Lorne, and I've had that in the East River Valley. And the service providers have came back and said, even with the free land, the business case doesn't work for us. So it's not going to happen in these areas, and they need cell service, and they deserve cell service. So my question for the Minister is, will the provincial government partner with any of these companies to help that cell service get there where we need it?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The objective, whether it's cell service or high-speed internet, Mr. Speaker, is to advance and broaden the availability across the province. Industry is taking the lead in that regard, and we are supporting them through the consultations we're having, through the studies and research that we've just recently completed, specific to high-speed internet. We'll continue to engage industry, Mr. Speaker, and as industry has told us, get out of our way, allow us to lead. We're supporting industry's efforts in that regard.
Order, please. I'd like to remind all members, when you do pose a question, it would be parliamentary to listen to the answer. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
We're still waiting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I guess our comment to that would be nice to have an answer once in a while, too. Yesterday, the government announced an overview of what the transition out of the Centennial Building at the Victoria General site should look like. Some services may be moved to the Dixon Centre or the Dixon Building, which will be undergoing renovation during the process at some point during the process. For years, Legionella bacteria has caused issues in the water supply at the VG site, including the Dixon Centre. But we have yet to hear whether or not it will be addressed and eradicated during the renovation. So my question to the Minister is, in the planning for this renovation, has the Minister received a cost analysis of what it would take to eliminate Legionella bacteria from the VG's water supply, which includes the Dixon Centre?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows from his time as Minister of Health, yes, it's been a perennial problem, Legionella in the VG. We also have the Dixon Centre now in scope for a refurbishment and an expansion. We want it to become the centre of cancer care excellence in Atlantic Canada, and we have the clinical teams that are supporting that concept, and we will be moving forward to make that a reality.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our province is blessed with world-class physicians and healthcare workers who offer services that are, of course, second to none. But when our hospital facilities deteriorate to the point that the issue of drinking water safety persists for nearly 20 years, it is time for a change, Mr. Speaker. So when Nova Scotians are in the hospital, they deserve a guarantee of clean, safe water. Can the Minister guarantee Nova Scotians that the water supply at the VG site will be free of Legionella bacteria once the renovations are underway?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that at the VG provisions have been made. They've been ongoing for years to provide potable water and to make sure that safe drinking water is in place there. I think what Nova Scotians are looking forward to is a safer, refurbished site at the Dixon Centre, and we will stay the course and get that completed as quick as possible.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Wednesday, the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development encouraged me to have a closer look at her government's report on the review of regulated childcare and indicated that her government is prepared to act on every single recommendation. I'll table that. So, Mr. Speaker, I can assure the Minister I have read the report, but I've also read the budget. So I see no money to ensure the efficiency and sustainability of the child care system. So my question for the Minister today is, how does the Minister intend to act on these recommendations without providing the funding necessary to make the changes?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to hear that the member did read it. I would encourage all members to read that report. It is probably one of the most significant changes that this government will make in early childhood education in this province. And it was made very clear, Mr. Speaker, that there is over $6 million that has been put into this year's budget. I'm not sure if the member can find it or not, but I'll find it for her. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, in the theatre we would say to that response, the lady methinks doth protest too much. Mr. Speaker, in 1983, the Nova Scotia Task Force on Daycare made recommendations to address the high cost of childcare and support training. In 1991, the Roundtable on Daycare presented a series of recommendations. In 2001, the report on the Nova Scotia Childcare Funding Review called for actions on wages, staff training and childcare affordability. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that in her response the Minister will say, well, the NDP had an opportunity to do something, but I have to say she was the Minister of Education for 3 years for the Conservatives. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister tell Nova Scotian families today how they plan to use what amounts to an investment of $63 per child to address these issues that have plagued early childhood education for 30 years?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite, I would encourage you to go back and perhaps reread the report because it's very clear where the money will be spent.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of DNR. Mr. Speaker, speaking about the government's failure to honour its promise to the mining industry to introduce a fuel tax rebate, Sean Kirby, Executive Director of Mining Association of Nova Scotia, told the media, "It will further harm the province's reputation as a place to invest. Nova Scotia cannot afford any further harm in its reputation for investment in mining. The Fraser Institute again has ranked Nova Scotia last in Canada for investment attractiveness in mining, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. The question to the Minister, could the Minister explain how his government can justify breaking this promise, harming the province's reputation for investment and killing potential jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. I was very pleased yesterday to be invited to speak at the AGM for the Mining Association of Nova Scotia, and like all good business people, as this government is and that association is, we put the issues on the table. I was very pleased to hear at that meeting the Mining Association's position on this, Mr. Speaker. Earlier I spoke about the process that we have here. Our first commitment in this province is to good fiscal management, and it's on the table. When we are in a position to be able to honour that commitment, we will do so. Also, Mr. Speaker, it is worthy of note that the mining industry in Nova Scotia is enjoying quite a considerable break from fuel prices as they conduct their business. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the former Minister of Finance told the industry in 2014 that the government would introduce this tax rebate in 2015. That did not happen, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. In 2015, the former Minister of DNR said the rebate would be distributed in the course of our mandate. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. And now, just this week, the current minister said it is under consideration. And, Mr. Speaker, if the desk will hold the weight of these papers, I'll table that also. Anyway, my question, Mr. Speaker, no wonder the province's reputation has been damaged. Will the minister clear this up once and for all and tell the industry when or if it actually plans to implement this important tax rebate?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would draw the House's attention to the 28th of April, when SIA will make its final utterance on a major mining project for Nova Scotia at the Vulcan site in Black Point that has the potential of 80 full-time, well-paying jobs for at least 50 years to assist Nova Scotians. I want to talk about Atlantic Gold, who are very soon have equipment on site and are interested in operating their facility. There's exploration activities occurring across the province. Donkin Mines is the gem that will bring mining back and jobs to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. So where's the problem?
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Energy. Industry experts have been saying that this government's plan will not lower electricity prices and that no real competition will come forward. And nearly 3 years later, they're proven outright, because Nova Scotians continue to pay their power bills to the exact same utilities as they did before the election. So my question, Mr. Speaker, and maybe we'll get an answer. Maybe you can help us see if we actually get an answer to this question. But my question for the Minister is, when can Nova Scotians expect to buy reasonably priced power from a new alternative energy supplier?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to give him an answer. He may not like it, but he's going to get one just the same. The fact is that prior to our government being elected in 2013, it wasn't even possible to talk about competition in the electricity marketplace in Nova Scotia. We changed that. Mr. Speaker, there's a process to be followed. We brought in legislation in this House that was passed. The next thing that had to be done was to go to
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Energy has the floor.
The next thing that had to be done was to go to the Utility and Review Board. That process is now working its way, and the fact is that the small business advocate, John Merrick, has said that with the decision of the Utility Review Board, there is now a new day in Nova Scotia to allow for competition.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and lots of talk there. And the question was when, and the answer was a new day, someday. No answer to that question, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians are still waiting Nova Scotians are still waiting for this government to deliver on its promise, and it's not happening, and there's no time in the future when it will happen. The minister doesn't want to say when. The minister can't say when Nova Scotians will be able to buy reasonably priced power because it won't happen. So he won't say when, but I'll ask him, does the department have any estimate? Can you give us a number of how many Nova Scotians, the question is, Nova Scotians will be able to buy power from a new supplier within the next 5 years, 10 years? Pick a number. How many Nova Scotians?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, this process...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, there's a process to be followed through the Utility Review Board. They have provided their first decision, which has been greeted by renewable energy producers as saying it's going in the right direction. The process will give the final numbers as to what will have to be paid by renewable energy producers. Mr. Speaker,
order, please. The Honourable Minister of Energy has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, the decision that will be made to provide competition in this province will be made by private industry, not by government. We were clearly told, get out of the way, allow the process to be followed.
Please. 'The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, the only people left in this province that don't believe that we'll have competition is the cynicism from the member from Pictou East and the leader of the official opposition. Nova Scotians asked for competition. We're allowing it to happen.
Eight more minutes, that's all we got. The Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, apparently yoga class must have been cancelled last night. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture. Just lately, in the recent months, the Minister announced a lobster handling course that would be mandatory to all lobster buyers across Nova Scotia if they wanted to renew their lobster buying license for the next season. My question to the Minister, will he tell the House if he consulted with the industry, the lobster industry, first on this topic?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, and indeed we have consulted with the industry and we have come to an arrangement with the industry.
The Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne.
Well, I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that the yoga class may come in handy on this one. Mr. Speaker, simply put, the Minister does not understand the science behind the creation of a soft-shell lobster. And I'm going to directly ask the Minister, will the Minister withdraw this scheduled lobster handling course and consult first with the lobster industry?
The Honourable Minister of Aquaculture and Fisheries.
We have consulted with the industry. We've made arrangements with the industry.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture has the floor.
I'll give the same answer. We have consulted with the industry. We've made arrangements with the industry, and it will be announced shortly.
The Honourable Member, the Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. It was reported on November 23rd that the Liberal government paid $1.9 million to Novastar. And documents filed with their bankruptcy show that they had $42,000 left in cash. And I remember at the time when that money went out, this government said, we're going to keep an eye on this, we're going to get reports and see where the money's going. But Novastar was supposed to report their spending to the Minister weekly, I believe. So my question to the Minister is, where did the $1.9 million go? Why do we have so many Nova Scotian companies that didn't get paid?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the member opposite, we did follow the obligations that we had with Nova Star. The commitment that was made last year, $13 million, was fulfilled on behalf of the province of Nova Scotia, just like any other arrangement we have with a private sector operator in any part of the functions of government, Mr. Speaker. We fulfilled our obligations. Clearly, as we've discussed many times here publicly as part of estimates, and I'm sure there'll be more, we made a change for operator for a number of reasons, and we're moving in the right direction. There's a long history with Nova Star, and we've moved on with Bay Ferries, and I hope the member and the party opposite supports it, because we have to make sure that Nova Scotia Ferry works for the entire province.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure all those Nova Scotia companies that got burned by this last deal and didn't get paid from the $1.9 million, they'll probably feel pretty good about that from the minister there. So we'll have to see, and I wish the expression of once burned, twice shy doesn't seem to ring through very good, because under that agreement, Nova Star had to report its spending. The minister was going to look at it weekly. Under this new agreement, it's just whatever the costs are, we'll keep paying them. So my question for the minister is, why should Nova Scotia companies trust this second ferry situation when the first one went so horribly wrong, even when they said we're watching closely now?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, to the member opposite, look, there is a history. We identified a number of challenges with Nova Star, the operations and the agreement, which was exactly the reason why we entered into a process to identify a new operator, a new service with a new business plan for the Nova Scotia Ferry, Mr. Speaker, without question. The member opposite knows the vital importance of ferries in his riding and his community. Northumberland provides a tremendous service, economic activity for his area. For the members from Cape Breton, obviously the Marine Atlantic run is vital to our local economy there. Mr. Speaker, as we've said many times and we will continue, Bay Ferries is the right operator. Mark McDonald's the right person. We believe in him. He believes in us and the people of this province. Despite what the opposition is saying, Mr. Speaker, this ferry will succeed for all Nova Scotians. It's a good decision. We support the people of southern Nova Scotia, but the entire province, and we stick behind that. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia tourist industry relies on bringing first-time visitors here and having them tell their friends and family about the beautiful province and friendly people, and we want them to come back again and again. And the low Canadian dollar now offers a great opportunity to attract more American travelers. Mr. Speaker, my question is this. With Nova Scotia taxpayer money going to the Ontario Ad Agency and tourism season underway now, my question to the Minister is this. When will we see a tourism strategy and ad campaign?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the member opposite is quite correct. The strategy is to attract first-time visitors, to have them stay longer and spend more money, and as they return home, they in fact become the ambassadors for the province of Nova Scotia. My colleague referenced money spent out of province. I don't know where the confusion lies, Mr. Speaker. If we're going to promote the province of Nova Scotia, we do that outside of the province, regardless of where that marketing contract went, Mr. Speaker. The most significant money would be spent out of province for marketing in Ontario, Quebec, and the northeastern USA.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, if the minister thinks that spending money in Ontario in an ad agency is going to improve tourism, unless there's an actual campaign, I can't quite fathom that. When will the ad campaign start? That's the question.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the recent videos that were released, Mr. Speaker, as part of that strategy, the work that is being done both by the contracted corporation and Trampoline, was a local agency they've partnered with. This is all driving towards our objectives of doubling tourism revenues in Nova Scotia. Those ads have started, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing a response from travellers. They're expressing an interest. It hits on our website. There's a significant amount of work being done, and we expect this will be another banner season in tourism in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians are concerned with the release of the budget on Tuesday. No real investment in health care to improve services across our province. We see increases in wait times in almost every sector and services delivered under health care, Mr. Speaker, and no answers from this government. They've spent 2.5 years amalgamating the district health authorities with no new initiatives to improve services, no new initiatives to decrease the emergency room closures that we see across this province, Mr. Speaker, and Nova Scotians are suffering because the lack of moving forward with important services like that, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why doesn't he think health care is a priority?
Please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable, just before we do that, the Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise on a point of order. Today in question period, the Minister of Fisheries announced that he had consulted on the topic of the lobster handling course. Early in media scrums,
this is not a point of order. This is a disagreement of facts. We'll now move on to government house business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, I move that you do not leave the chair and that the House resolve itself into a committee on supply.
The House will now resolve itself into the Committee on Supply and will now recess for a few minutes while we do so. Oh, pardon me. We have a debater before we go into Committee on Supply. The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me honour to go in speaking into supply this morning, partially to